All right. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Annalee Newitz. My pronouns are they, them. I am a science journalist and a science fiction writer, and my latest novel is called The Terraformers. And I am super, super excited to be here once again with Mike Chen. And we're talking about his newest book, Vampire Weekend. Mike and I are friends, and now we are writing in the shared Newitz Chen universe. Find out more when you read Vampire Weekend. And later this summer, San Mateo County Libraries are going to be welcoming Leo Min, who's author of Beating Heart Baby, Lisa C., who is the author of Lady Tan's Circle of Women, and Rita Chang Epig, author of Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea. So check all of those out. And also,
Rita wrote an amazing essay on this book about how this book tackles the model minority myth through the metaphor of vampire. It's on Tor.com. I don't have a link right now, but if you Google Rita's name and Tor.com and Vampire Weekend, you should. It's everything. It hit all of the cultural themes. Oh, there we go. It hit all of the cultural themes and the personal immigration themes that I really, really want to nail on this book.
Well, maybe we can talk about that a little bit in our Q&A, because I would love to. Back when I was a professor at Berkeley, I used to teach a course on the model minority. So I would have been able to teach this book.
Yes. That is why I don't want my parents to read this. They've read all of my other books, but I didn't tell them when this one came out.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I hid it.
That's a good, it's a good call. Okay. So for tonight's logistics, your microphone and video will be turned off, not yours, Mike, but everybody else's. So feel free to use the chat, and you can talk to us in chat. And also you can submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A box, which is down at the bottom. It says Q&A and it has two little cartoon dialogue boxes. If you'd like to access closed captions for this event, you can click on CC and then show subtitle, and you'll get closed captions. And they're actually pretty good. I use them all the time. So I'm super happy to welcome you, Mike Chen. And I'm going to read a little bio in case you guys are not familiar yet with the amazing output of Mike Chen. He's a lifelong writer. He crafted fan fiction as a kid and somehow has tricked people into paying him for words as an adult. He's contributed to major geek websites such as the Mary Sue and Tor. He's covered the NHL for mainstream media outlets, unnamed mainstream media outlets, apparently. In previous lives, Mike worked as a sports journalist, a DJ, a musician, and an aerospace engineer. He lives in the Bay Area, where he can be found playing video games and watching Doctor Who with his wife, daughter, and many rescue animals. And I am so glad to be back in conversation with you tonight, Mike. This is our tradition.
I know. Thank you
need
for
to talk
doing
about
this.
all of your books. I'm a huge fan, so this is really awesome. All right, so let's start at the beginning. So you've now written novels about time travel, superheroes, alien abduction, and now vampires.
Yes.
So why did you pick vampires? What appealed to you about that trope? Why did it come next after all that other stuff?
So the origin story of this book goes back to my teen years in the 90s when I was a very angsty teen. And even actually here, I will show, I'm wearing a Castlevania hoodie right now.
Nice.
So even when I was playing Nintendo in the 80s, something about vampires and goth aesthetic really drew me. And then when I became an angsty teen, and this falls into the whole model minority thing, where I tried to talk with my parents about my feelings and they were not equipped to do that. And I found punk rock and indie and new wave. I found Anne Rice books. I found these expressions of really pure emotion, and it really connected to me. And so I have loved so many iterations of vampires and goth aesthetic my whole life. And then I've always wanted to write a vampire book. And of course, there was about 15 years where vampires were not being touched by publishing. And so I think it was around, I believe it was 2020, fall 2020, when, who was it? Kellen Sparra and another one of our mutuals announced vampire books around the same time. And I texted my agent right away and I said, "Are vampires back? Can I pitch you a vampire book?" And he said, "Yeah." I'm like, "Well, what is the window for this?" And he said, "I think publishing will accept it for probably about 4 or 5 years before they cycle through again." And so within 2 weeks, I had the proposal for Vampire Weekend. The whole plot, everything like stayed exactly the same the entire time. I just
Wow.
totally fleshed it out. It was the goal was to take my love of vampires and like I had thought of I'd always wanted to write a music book too, because I mean, like, you and I have talked about our love of, punk and different bands. And like, I always wanted to fuse that really into a story in a way that I compare it to like Nick Hornby, his memoir, Fever Pitch.
Hmm.
So Nick Hornby is primarily known for fiction, like about a boy and High Fidelity and Juliet Naked and things like that. But his first book was when he was a sports journalist, and he wrote a memoir about his fandom of the English Premier League team Arsenal, and he would line up various events of his life to like how the team was doing. And so it was not just about like the team itself, it was how they personally affected him during that time. And like I always loved that as a narrative device. And I
Hmm.
wanted to do something about music that way. And so this like kind of became this whole thing of like just fusing these different ideas together and then realizing that punk and vampires is how I dealt with my, being the child of immigrant angst. And so that had to go into here too. And then there's like, there's data equity, there's unionization, there's a lot of politics in there.
Yeah,
I'm an
it is like one of your, I'd say it's one of your most political books in a way.
Yeah, it is. It's very up there. It's funny because like the hidden elder society of vampires in this. I remember like I was talking with my editor about it, and she was like, "Wow, the elders like they just don't get it, huh?" And I'm like, "Yeah," and she's like, "So they're kind of like the boomer Republicans of vampires." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's that's basically it." They're wondering why you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and they're like, "But we don't have any blood to eat every day. We have to do something about that." And I was like, I really wanted to bring all of that together, like the sort of like equity discussion, but through the lens of something kind of ridiculous like vampires.
Hmm. I want to get back to the equity question and
Mhm.
the boomer elders in a second, and just go back to what you were saying about model minority and vampires, because I wondered if you were thinking about kind of the Dracula myth, since Dracula is an immigrant in
Mhm.
London, and
You know, oh,
he's marginalized, like
mhm.
he's from a Eastern European or Central European area that would have been viewed as kind of I mean, at the time, they would have been viewed almost as people of color within British society. So were
When
you thinking of that, or was that's just
Yeah,
me getting
in
excited?
in college, I took a comparative literature class where we read a bunch of like uh, gothy, not like Nine Inch Nails gothy, but like gothic literature,
Yeah.
Dracula, Faust, things like that. And I remember talking about Dracula because I had already read it before, and I had obviously seen like the Coppola movie and like
Hmm.
other iterations of it. But then when we were doing the discussion, and they're like, "This is an allegory about immigration and racism," and I'm like, "Oh my god, it totally is!" Like I did not see it at first.
Yeah.
The idea of the vampirism is really like in so many in almost every fiction, it is an allegory for something. Like I think about even like True Blood, it's an allegory for being queer. There are
Hmm.
many stories where it's an allegory for like basically heroin or like other hard drugs. Um,
Hmm.
in this case, like I want to be like very aware of like the previous uses of like allegory.
Hmm.
And for but like the main thing that I want to do is like Louise's story in this and her I guess like identity issues. I wanted it to be so grounded that like it could be any child of immigrants.
Hmm.
And like the vampirism part is not really like a metaphor in there. What it does is it's a narrative device that lets her kind of be forever young. and never really deal with those things until her past catches up to her. And
Hmm.
so it's the device of having like she is technically like 75 years old, but she's still hanging out with like 20 somethings, in clubs in San Francisco and not really advancing her own sense of self. And I thought like that's always a really interesting thing to look at, like that's sort of the way that time affects people and their relationships, especially their like family relationships that they don't really get along.
Yeah. Yeah. I really liked there's a moment where she's thinking about how she's actually much closer in her emotional life to this teenager,
Hmm.
Ian, who's I guess basically like her
Grandnephew, yeah.
grandnephew, yeah. And much closer to him than her brother
Hmm.
in terms of her emotional development, because like you said, she's been able to stay young and like keep just going to shows and living this really kind of precarious life of like working, part-time jobs and stuff like that. So yeah, that's super interesting. So I wanted to get back to the politics of this too.
Hmm.
Like why did the vampire story, how did that allow you to kind of get into these political issues that you don't normally deal with in your work?
I think part of it was I was just really angry at the time.
So not so
Um,
much vampires as the time you wrote the book.
yeah, I think because I mean, so there is part of it where I like to take, and I know you've read my stuff, so take these fantastical ideas and then really ground them in like the reality of the moment, not just the emotional reality of the moment, but like the practical reality of the moment. So then with this, it was like, okay, if you have vampires living in our modern society, how do they deal with things that like cell phones are everywhere, cameras are everywhere, data is everywhere. So it's not like they can just go, glamour someone and then bite them, because they would be, that video would go viral so fast,
Yeah, yeah.
and I pretty sure they don't have like the IT person that can like scrub it from, the entirety of the internet. So I wanted to think about as a society, they would have had to adapt to all the shifting changes. And they talk about how in like the 1800s or so, like they would allow murder because it's a means of hunting and feeding, but now like they can't do it because it exposes them too much, and also it's just not really cool to go around killing people. um so then it goes up to the issue of like if society has evolved and there's still like everyone has to eat, and if you've taken away a lot of the mechanisms for how people can eat and earn a living, what do you do, especially when you realize that there is a higher power that's basically just controlling like the opening and closing the valve of access. um
Hmm.
and so I mean that is such an allegory for so much of our world now, like in terms of like physical, like food, water, data, all this stuff, where like there's all these gatekeepers that are constantly getting in the way. And so to be able to play with that like on a vampire level, I thought it made sense too, because like vampires, they're only eating one thing. Like this, the way that the vampires in this book are designed, it's like it is a sustenance thing. So like their most of their organs have functionally shut down. And so like they say right up front in this, it's like this is not like any other vampire story you've read, because there's no sex in it. Their sex organs have shut down. They are taking in blood to basically keep blood flowing through their body, going to their brain, going to their heart. So those are like the key organs that need to function in this. So in terms of sustenance, they need like each person, I forget, I calculated the amount that they would need.
I love that you did that.
It was like 3 to 5 cups of blood a day or something like
Uh-huh.
that. And so it's calories and actual like circulation inside their body to keep their organs going. And
Yeah.
so because
And
it's
they
just
get
this,
like dizzy
mhm,
and like kind of
it's like if you get
nauseous and
hungry,
stuff
yeah.
when they don't eat. Yeah.
So it's this thing where if it's just this one thing that they need, then I remember I got a review where someone put like, this is the best allegory for universal basic income I've ever read. I'm like, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Because it can be taken for these different things. It's just like, what
Hmm.
is the thing that you need to eat and who is gatekeeping that from you and why?
Yeah. And I wanted to bring up the fact that like there's also this menacing app that the vampire community is using. I mean, initially quite menacing
Mhm.
because it gets installed on your phone, and it's the way that you're supposed to. It's a social media app for
Yeah,
vampires,
it's
and
like Yelp for vampires.
yeah, Yelp, but it's also like Discord kind
Mhm.
of, and like, because they're using it to chat, and like, but it's also, it won't uninstall, which is
Mhm.
something that actual apps do, especially
Yeah.
malicious apps. And it's like interacting with all their other apps and like sucking up all this personal data. And so the app itself is like vampiric. And I wondered if you were channeling any feelings about Silicon Valley and its
Yeah.
possibly vampiric relationship
I mean,
to
I've
data.
been in Silicon Valley, like, essentially my whole life. Um, and I've seen how we innovate here and then we ruin the world at the same time. It's like it is constantly these parallel paths of like creating things that have so much potential for good, and they somehow always wind up like pulling along all the bad at the same time. And what I wanted to talk about with this is like I wanted to make sure it didn't come off as too much of a caricature. Like that was really important.
Hmm.
Because I think like what often happens with Silicon Valley innovations, it's not that they're going out to like make something malicious or like vampiric, no pun intended. It's just they don't even realize it. It's like they have these ambitions of like, being disruptors or whatever, and like with genuine good goals, and they cannot possibly see the way that it goes bad. And that was one of the things that I wanted to do here, was like, you know, Eric, like the local community vampire leader who is kind of organizing all of this, he talks about like, you have to invade people's phones right now because you have to make sure that they're not exposing this community. As we're trying to form people together, we have to make sure that like they're not putting this all at risk. And so when there is a lot of good that comes with it, and then there's a big discussion near the end of like, have you thought about like maybe people abusing this? And
Hmm.
I think that's one of the big things that often happens with just all technological leaps is like there are so many ways to abuse these things, and we don't even think about how it could possibly happen.
Hmm. Yeah.
I feel
I
like
want
that
to, oh, go ahead.
every major startup needs like a data ethicist on their board.
Yeah. Or
There you
like,
go.
I don't know, like, yeah, like a whole department of ethicists instead
Yeah.
of like, say, laying them all off just as you're launching a very ethically sus product.
Yeah, exactly.
um, so are there any vampire tropes that you definitely wanted to avoid in this book where you were just like, absolutely not, this is not going to be a thing in the book?
I think the main thing is that like I didn't want this to be like sexy vampire story. I
Yeah.
because I wanted to just avoid that. And I remember reading when I was reading Anne Rice, um because like Anne Rice's books are like super sexual, but their sex organs are functionally dead. And like I remember that was one of the first things in Interview with the Vampire that I thought like, oh, this is really interesting. And so she takes like the act of actually feeding into like that sort of euphoria that comes with it.
Hmm.
And like I just kind of wanted to step away from that because to me it didn't really make a lot of sense, like from just a grounded science perspective. Um,
Hmm.
and then like there are the other stories of like in True Blood, like when they are physically like having sex, and I'm like, how do you do that? Like if the traditional vampire story is that like your organs have shut down and there's no physical like biological need to procreate, why are these things like still physically possible? So like I wanted
Yeah.
to shut that down right away
It
and
was
like,
like, I think it's supposed to be part of their super strength in True Blood for
oh, is
sure.
that
Yeah,
it?
I mean it is because like, well, I mean, you see that they can do it like super fast, and like
Yeah.
vampire sex is very dangerous because it's like, they do it so quickly, which I feel like is the same thing. I mean, I feel like that's a trope in a lot of recent vampire stories that like sex is dangerous because they'll like, Bella will be destroyed because the bed will be broken, and like, what will happen. Yeah, anyway, sorry. Side note. So you wanted
Yeah.
to make sure that it wasn't like sexy time biting when they
Yeah,
when they
exactly. Like,
fed.
and the Louise talks about that. Like one of the framing devices in this book is like to take like these vampire tropes, and then she kind of directly addresses it to the audience about like, that these are kind of like completely false. And one of them is like biting into the neck is easy.
Yeah.
And I've often thought about this as a big fan of vampires because, like, like the teeth cannot be that sharp. Like they can't.
They're
And
also
like
like at the side of the
yeah.
mouth. Like, how are you going to do that? I don't
So
know.
the analogy that I believe she used in this book is like she says like trying to bite into a pair of red vines like taped onto like a loaf of sourdough bread. And so it's like you have to pierce them exactly. And it's like it's really hard.
Yeah.
And so early on they talk about how like if it looks like a werewolf attack, then that's more likely a vampire attack because like you can't just bite into and make like, these two perfect little holes where you could just start sucking blood and it's like that doesn't make any. So yeah, a lot of those were just fun for me to like take on from a practical level, or like the idea of like turning into mist. Like I never understood that at all. Like
Yeah, that's just like I feel like that's the moment at which like vampires just became like an all-purpose like spooky creature. It's
yeah,
like, oh, they can turn into a bat and mist and they have super strength and whatever. So yeah.
like
Um
I love vampires. I watch so much like vampire TV and stuff, but like I will fully admit that like a lot of it just doesn't make like there's no logic to it. And as someone who like tries to base my own work in science, like I wanted to make sure that like this felt like, they could have a if someone put these vampires into a lab, they could understand it.
Yeah. That's what I liked about the movie The Hunger, which I bet you've seen since
Yes.
it's David Bowie who's a
Yes.
major figure in this novel. Yeah, because that in fact they don't bite people. They have a little knife that they use, which highly recommend, by the way. If you liked this book, you should definitely go see The Hunger, classic 80s vampire movie. Well, let's talk a little bit about the characters. We're going to open this up for questions in about 15 minutes. So if you guys have questions, please be sure to put them in the Q&A box, by the way, or if you can't figure out how to work the Q&A box, you can stick them in the chat and we'll see them. So one of the things that this novel has in common with, I think, all of your work is that it's very character
Mhm.
focused. It's
Yeah.
a small scale story. It's not about like a giant vampire uprising. I mean, there we get a bit of that, but it's like there's not, this is really focused in on Louise and her
Mhm.
family and her
Yeah.
relationship with them, and her kind of figuring out how to reconcile with them. And I was recently talking with Becky Chambers about this idea of cozy science fiction, which you are very much in this tradition of cozy science fiction, where it's an alternate reality, or there's something different about reality, but really what we focus on is cozy relationships between characters. And by cozy, I don't mean like happy relationships, but just like small domestic
Mhm.
relationships. And one of the things that Becky said that I thought was really interesting is that cozy science fiction allows us to be more hopeful, because when you focus in on human relationships or relationships between a few people, it's easier to imagine how they might reconcile, how they might deal with problems. It's a lot easier than like say in The Expanse, where it's like, how do you fix a broken solar system
Yeah.
versus like, how do you fix a family? And I wonder if that's something that you think about when you're writing. Like, do you think about hope as a theme or a vibe in your work?
Yeah, and I'm gonna shout out Annalee's The Terraformers because it kind of touches on all of that and is still really epic too in like world building that like I could possibly like I could never do. So
Well, thanks.
um
There's some characters in there too.
I I think like I never like I started writing contemporary stories. This was like 15 years ago, so before I got an agent. And it was really the idea I didn't think there was space for character focus in science fiction and in publishing like it hadn't quite moved there yet.
Mhm.
Um and so the idea was like I as much as I enjoy epic stuff, my favorite moments in my favorite epic stories are always these slice of life character moments. And that is why like I think I'm really enjoying like the swatch of new Star Trek shows so much because like they are really leaning into those character moments even when like the fate of the galaxy is at stake.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think it's like the political machinations and you know things like that. It's like I enjoy watching it to a certain degree, but if it's like really, really bleak, I found that like I think it's probably like post 2016. Like my taste for bleak just does not exist anymore. And it's like even
Hmm.
in my own life, like I have found, like especially like post COVID, with like my wife has a medical condition, and then it's like, we're always looking at like, I think she's more bleak than I am. Like I am just like a, like, probably like to a frustrating level, like extremely constructive person, because I'm just at a point in my life where I'm like, even if everything is terrible, we can still be together and have an enjoyable moment. So like, how do we constructively bring that back into our lives? Like whether it's like, dining outside or just staying home and watching Star Trek. Like how do we do this constructively? And I think like that has trickled down into like all of my characters.
Hmm. So that's where you see the hope, is like having those moments.
Yeah.
And I on that tip, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how all of your books, but especially this book, make me cry. I think I'm probably not the only person that experiences this. I'm not like an easy crier. And I wondered if, do you think about that when you're writing? Do you think like, oh yeah, this is the weepy scene, or like, do you cry when you're writing certain scenes? Like, how does
One of
that
the
work
things
for you?
about being an Asian kid with a lot of repressed emotions is that like I rarely cry like ever. I mean, it's like
Uh-huh.
usually only
Getting back
like,
to the model minority thing.
yeah. And so being able to express it through art and other stuff is probably like the most that I will channel it. I think like the closest thing that like got me like right on the edge was in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show when Obi-Wan apologized to Anakin, and I was like, "Oh my god, my favorite character's doing it. They're really doing it." But I think like when I am writing it, like, I mean, I'm really just trying to think of like, I want the characters to be bold enough that like they say the things that have to be said. And often when you go there, you have to, that's where like, if you weren't a repressed Asian kid, you would cry.
Hmm.
um
So you don't
because
get like choked up in certain scenes as you're writing them, or
I
like,
think
I
I
mean, you don't have to, you don't have to weep blood. Okay. You could just like feel a little like,
no, I do. I think like, especially when I'm at a point where I know the characters really really well, then it gets to something where I feel like, I want this for them. I want this catharsis for them, and it does get there.
yeah. There's definitely some scenes between Louise and her grandnephew where she's teaching him guitar or taking him to his first concert. And I was totally like, oh my God. It's just so I don't know. It just, I have a teenage gothy nephew. So it's like very much hit me in the place. Um, okay, so I wanted to ask you a bit about the music in the book. There's obviously this whole book is built around music. There's amazing scenes where we just sort of have like technical discussions of fingering on a guitar
Mhm.
and stuff. And I was actually wondering something about kind of your writing process, which is, does the music that you're thinking about in a scene, does that ever affect like the pacing of the writing in the scene?
Mm.
Because I feel like a lot of your work is very fast paced, in the sense that I'll be reading it and I'm just like, I cannot put this down. Like I'm zooming through it. And then there'll be moments where it kind of slows down a little bit. Like, is that something that is triggered by music for you, or feels musical to you, or?
Someone, I forget which writer it was talking about how they have a writing playlist for a book, and they pick a song for each chapter to represent the rhythm of it. And I've never done that before, but I really thought that was an interesting technique.
Mhm.
Um, for this book, it's more, I mean, part of it is just like writing about songs that I really love.
Yeah.
um, but so a fun fact about my writing career: the first book that I ever queried and tried to send to agents was a book of, it was called Local Band. It was about my time, like essentially like transposing like my experience playing in bands in San Francisco in like the aughts. And it had no plot at all. Like it was just like stuff happening to this band. The characters
Mhm.
were fun, but there were little quirks and things that I wound up lifting from that and putting into this. So like the fact that Louise names all of her guitars. Like that was taken from the protagonist of that manuscript. And there's a scene in there where I really want to get the feeling of like when you're playing in a band and you know everyone is locked in and there's like a certain like rhythm and build up and like a euphoria that kind of comes to it. And I wanted to capture that in when I wrote that manuscript. And so I remember there was like it was somewhere in the first act, and it's like the first time like they play this song together, and it really, really clicks. And the descriptions for that go back to like in this book, the Grape Ape show,
Mm-hmm.
where like Louise is talking about like, you know, why is this locking in for Ian? And a lot of the descriptions of like the drums and like the bass and like what it all means and like, you know, the sort of catharsis you feel like when you're screaming along, like that was lifted from that first manuscript. So it was like they're like definitely different vibes. There's a lot of talk of like a Joan Baez song, and
Mm-hmm.
that one, like when you listen to it, it's just four lines repeated over and over as like piano and other things come in. And there's like this, I guess like this is gonna sound very lyrical. There's an empty fury to it. Because it like it just gradually builds, but it's so focused on her voice, and like there's just this quiet anger that goes onto it. And I wanted that to be brought into when she's thinking about her aunt's death of as like kind of like this symbolic of the moment of like she's angry, her aunt is not, but then like it's also very empty and it feels empty, but it also feels appropriate. So tonally, like it had to be the musical choices had to fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that Joan Baez song is so interesting because we watch multiple characters respond to that song and they
Mhm.
all have different reactions to it. I mean, they're all members of the same family. They're all listening to the song and like they're each kind of like, whoa, why are there only 4 lines? And
Yeah,
we see how their responses to it evolve over time, which is exactly how music is. Like it changes the more you listen to it. So okay, so I wanted to return back to the model minority thing that we were talking about earlier, because one of the things I thought was really interesting about this book is that Louise does talk about issues around identity. She talks about racism. She talks about kind of anxiety because now she's asexual. And so she has kind of sexual identity anxiety. She has family trauma. And she's also a vampire. And it's kind of like it's an intersectional identity. You know,
mhm,
vampires like part of her intersectional identity, but it seems like um it doesn't feel to me, I guess, like the vampirism was a metaphor for something. It felt like it was just like yet another part of her
yeah.
identity. And I wondered if how that fits in with the sort of sub theme of being a model minority, or like if you could just sort of talk about the complexity of her identity.
I think with a lot of the Asian kids that I know, like we're like we grew up with stereotypical, and this is like the spectrum of Asian, like Southeast Asian, you know, East Asian. Like there's so much emphasis on like like the creatives I know who are of that background. We always talk about how it was like reaching for something like we are creative because we are looking for a mode of expression, and we did not get that from our parents or our immediate family, and we understand why. It's like, you know, there's not really blame there, but it's still like extremely frustrating, and like it builds this need in there. And for Louise, both the music and the vampirism is like an extension of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really important because like when you a lot of uh I will say certain members of my family um, feel like they are emotionally locked into a certain age, because like they never went to like 2 decades of therapy like I have,
Mm-hmm.
and like they've never really pushed themselves to try to dig past all of this stuff and see what is actually underneath and why. And so vampirism really felt like, for kids who like grow up emotionally stunted, it's a very apt metaphor for that because now your physical body is as frozen as your emotional self.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Did you think at all about the fact that Louise was born in the 50s? And so her experience of racism would be really different from someone like of our generation or
Yeah.
younger?
Yeah, I did, and like she talks a little bit about it with so in like the late 60s, early 70s, the only hint of anger she sees from her dad is when he realizes that like he's being promoted or someone else is being promoted over him for no reason whatsoever other than he's an Asian immigrant. um, and he quickly reverts and he says, this is still like the best country to live in and we are here for a better life, and so I can't be mad about that.
Hmm.
um, and I certainly heard versions of that growing up, but I think like having like growing up in the 80s, you had started to see Asians in pop culture. Like they were stereotypes, but they actually existed. And
Hmm.
growing up in the Bay Area, it was like, a quarter of the kids at my school were Asian. So it was like it was much more prevalent, I think. And so it was probably easier to like you can feel things were on the cusp of being able to like express ourselves. And I think that's why there's so many Gen X Asian creatives who are just like really angry,
Hmm.
but trying to put that into something. And so Louise is like just on the edge of that, and it makes sense to me that she really gloms onto like both someone like Bowie who transforms who he is into like his glam persona, his whatever persona, and then like all the associated acts like Iggy Pop and like Lou Reed and Velvet Underground, where they're just like, no, we're just angry, and we're going to express it this way. And like she feels like all of those feelings. She's like, I wish I could be like this. And so that's where she gets a lot of that.
Yeah, that's really cool. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question. Then we have. I'm going to remind everybody that you can put your question in the Q&A box if you have some questions for Mike. So I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little, catch us up on some of the other work that you're doing. You're doing a ton of stuff in the Star Wars universe. You have comic books. Can you tell us like what's going on? Where is Mike in the Star Wars universe at this point?
So last year, I had Star Wars Brotherhood, which was my Obi-Wan and Anakin story that took place right between Attack of the Clones and the Clone Wars. And it is a very character-driven story again. And I was surprised that people really, really liked it. A lot of the feedback was like, we've seen 7 seasons of the Clone Wars. It's nice for them to actually just slow down and figure out why they got there. And so I before that I did a short story about it's from a certain point of view anthologies where they take the movies and they rewrite scenes from a different point of view in the scene. And so I got to write the scene where Vader talks, where Vader zooms with Palpatine, and but from Palpatine's perspective, and it's from Palpatine's perspective, he is seeing that Vader is still really Anakin Skywalker. It was kind of like it led me into writing Brotherhood. And so for the upcoming Return of the Jedi anthology, they asked me to write the final chapter, which is Anakin Skywalker returns, from being Darth Vader. So like it's very weird for
Wow.
me to think like,
Yeah.
I have some measure of ownership over, like the most important character in Star Wars. So that's coming out in, I should know this. I think it's September. I know they moved the date a little bit, but I
Hmm.
believe it's either early September or late August. And then in Star Trek, so Heather Antos of IDW saw that I was tweeting a lot about how much I love Deep Space Nine. And she messaged me and she said, we're looking for a writer for a Deep Space Nine miniseries. Do you want to pitch a Deep Space Nine miniseries? And so I sent her 5 pitches, and we went with we merged 2 of them. One of them is about Cisco dealing with like his Borg trauma, but then also Quark gets a dog. And, and so we are in the middle of releasing. We just released issue 3, issue 4, like their monthly releases. The miniseries is called Deep Space Nine: The Dog of War. It involves Quark getting a dog. It involves Cisco confronting his Borg trauma. It involves the Dominion War. It takes place in season 6, right after they retake Deep Space Nine. And it's like I just went for everything. Like if you made a checklist of like the things to include, like I just went for it all, and they actually approved all of it. I can't believe that.
So awesome. And
So
so
yeah.
also it's a corgi, the dog.
Hmm.
And so and there's also a very important corgi character in Vampire Weekend.
Hmm.
Do you have a corgi? Like, what's going on here?
I had a corgi from, I think we adopted her in like 2011 and she died in like 2017. And so my wife and I have had 4 dogs during our time together. And do not tell like the resting souls of the other dogs, but that corgi was like my dog. Like she's just,
Oh.
you just kind of know. Like there's always like one animal where it's like there's something about them. And so it's funny because like I say like I have just released my corgi trilogy because Star Wars Brotherhood has the giant corgi beasts of Cato Nemoidia that are like giant space corgis, and like
Mhm.
Asajj Ventress soothes one when it is hurting and stuff. And then I have this one where Louise's corgi Lola is named after my corgi Lola.
Oh.
Um, Louise named hers like in the book after the Kinks song, which we did not, but we did sing that to her when we were putting her to bed. So,
Mhm.
and then Deep Space Nine, Quark gets a corgi named Latinum, which he named.
That makes, yeah, that
Yeah.
tracks. Yeah.
So yeah, that's my corgi trilogy.
Awesome. And so are we going to have other like pet related trilogies in the future? Like, I don't.
Um, I have so let's see. I've had both of my greyhounds that I've owned. Like I try to put one of my animals in every single one of my stories. So in my upcoming January time loop book, A Quantum Love Story, my dwarf cat, my very fluffy dwarf cat named Maggie. She's only 6 pounds, and she's like the
Mhm.
most adorable cat. Like, and she knows it too. Um, so she is in that book. And then my wife's stepdad's, he had the most gentle pit bull rescue that he named Butthead. But I figured like I can't do that in the book, so I named him Buddy Ed, but it's Butthead. But Butthead would like when you would go see him, he'd walk up to you and then he would just like lean into your hip until you bent down and hugged him. All he
Aw.
wanted was hugs all the time. And so I want like what I would look at it as like it's my way of giving my animals like a little bit of immortality, to pass on. And then also when hopefully when my daughter is old enough to read my books, like she'll be able to say like, oh, that's so and so, and then we can look at the pictures and stuff together.
That's so great. So this brings me to a question that I'm really curious about, because I feel like you've hit on a lot of sci-fi tropes and horror tropes in the books that you've written so far. It feels to me like you're doing kind of like a just picking like so many major tropes out of the genre. So
Hmm.
are you going to ever have like a talking animal story, like a fantasy where there's like actual dog characters that are like at the center of the plot as opposed to
So
just being cute and shedding?
I would say, not in a fantasy sense. Like I can't ever see myself like Vampire Weekend is probably as fantasy as I will go.
Mm-hmm.
I'm much more science fiction. Um, I good timing on this question because I am just
Ooh.
talking with my agent about like my next adult proposals, and one of them involves it makes I wanted to make the dog not just like a periphery character but like a key supporting character and central to both like the practical plot and the emotional plot of it, and try to find a way to communicate with like the protagonist. So I'm figuring that out right now.
So like Lassie in Space, maybe, kind of.
Kind of, yeah. Well, I pitched it to my friend and she was like, this is like The Last of Us in space with a dog. Like,
Ooh,
so
okay.
we'll see. Like there's still like proposals have to be written and then submitted. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, I'm looking forward to like finally having like a Mike Chen non-human animal character. Um, okay, so we have one question in the Q&A from Chris Jones, who says he has a writing question for you.
Hmm.
Or they have I don't know if Chris is a whatever. Anyway, so they have a writing question for you, which is, as a parent, how do you manage your time to crank out a book a year? It's incredibly impressive, and I would love to hear about your time management.
Oh, so this is the way that I typically work when I am in peak drafting mode. But I will say, like, even outlining mode I do this too. Well, one thing I learned from the Star Wars experience. So Star Wars, I had to draft in 3 months. I had, I think, 6 weeks to go from a 5,000 word synopsis, and I ballooned that up to about 25,000 words over 6 weeks. Because like every time I added details, Lucasfilm had to approve them. So it was a very iterative process. I found that having that massive synopsis to work with just made everything easier because I would just take like, the paragraphs and just break them off and be like, this is a chapter, this is a chapter. And I would do my pacing from there. So one thing I have shifted into doing is making not quite as big of a synopsis as that, but like the last few that I've done have been about like 8,000 words. And then I break them up into chapters and then I really polish the first act first. So then I can really understand and feel like the voice in the world and everything. In terms of like finding the time to do that, I do about like maybe 30 to 60 minutes in the morning before my daughter gets up. During the workday, instead of like taking a long lunch break or, people take zone out breaks where they work on their fantasy sports or whatever, like I do several like 15 to 30-minute sprints during the workday as my breaks. And then I try not to let it be too invasive into the evening, but usually about like 30 to 45 minutes after my daughter goes to bed. Um, if I'm in like real crunch time, I'll tell my wife, I'm like, I need like 3 weeks where, I just write at night and, we just kind of go with it. Um, I've just become really good at writing in like 15 to 20-minute bursts. Like if you can adjust your mental working to accept that, it like you don't become constrained to like, I need 3 hours to do this. It's like you can just jump in. And a trick that I've learned to do that is I will bullet point a scene. So like if I'm typing and I am just like running out of like prose juice in my brain, I will still visualize it like I'm seeing a movie. Like I can see like the angle, the expression of the face, like the blocking and everything, and I will just bullet point what's happening. So I have basically mapped out like what is happening in the scene, and usually the dialogue goes in there too. But the prose, to create like a rhythm to the reading and stuff, like that's not there yet. But
Mhm.
to me, like that's just like kind of painting over like the bones of it. So if I can get through the bones of it, then I can first draft it.
Wow. So basically you're a Jedi.
I'm an engineer.
But the whole thing of like, if you can just get into the mind space to write for 15 minutes, I'm like, that is a Jedi mind trick for sure.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to do that one day, but
It was not easy at first. And so I was lucky that I had two friends, Wendy Hurd and Diana Urban. I'm going to shout them out. And they're actually, I named a Jedi after them in Brotherhood. So there's Durbin Wen Hurd is a Jedi who is like gets her trial to knighthood on Anakin Skywalker. That's Diana and Wendy like combined into one. And because like they were on deadline the same time I was, and we agreed that like we're on this group chat and we just talk about publishing and life and stuff every day. But we're like, okay, when one of us gets on, we're going to tell the others and say, like, I'm going to sprint for 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever. And if we're available to, we will drop everything and do that. And that we really helped each other like get attuned to the really weird rhythm of that.
mhm,
And I know like what we do individually in there is different. Like I don't think they bullet point the way that I do, but
mhm.
it's just being able to find whatever works for you and turn it off and turn it on within that time frame.
Yeah. All right. We have a couple of questions that people wrote in when they registered for the event. So I'm not sure who asked this question, but they said, what a great title. How did you get the title for this book?
So if you're not aware, there is a very popular indie rock band called Vampire Weekend. And because it's a music themed vampire book, I picked that. And I did not actually reference them in the bands listed because I thought it would be too meta to actually call that out. But one of their most popular songs is called Oxford Comma, and it's about who gives a blank about the Oxford comma, which I do a lot.
I mean, I
Um,
have feelings about it.
I am very pro Oxford comma. So like
Oh,
as a as an the Oxford comma is like the difference between like meanings. It's like in specificity. Like okay, I I'm
I'll
very passionate about the Oxford comma.
Okay, so this is
So
like where you vibe with the band is the Oxford
yes.
comma feeling. Okay.
So I there's a line in there where Eric, like the lead vampire, talks about like the Oxford comma, and he says like it's very important to like understanding like in communication or something like that. And that is my nod to Vampire Weekend, the band.
Nice. Other than the title.
Yes.
Yeah. So someone else asks, at what age did you start writing?
Oh, I well, God, I'm probably like 8 or 9. I did a lot of comic strip writing, um,
Hmm.
and it
Like
was
you
like,
would draw the comic strip and
mhm,
then you would,
yeah,
oh,
it was
cool.
very fan fiction based. I
Hmm.
would take, it was funny because like looking back now, I remember one of them very specifically. Like, so I would mash up like my favorite properties together. So, I know you're an '80s geek too. Do you remember the Space Quest series of PC games?
No,
Okay, so there was
I did
King's
not play a lot of
Quest.
games in the 80s. So
Okay.
that's an embarrassing fact about me.
Did you know King's Quest, that title? It was
Mm-mm.
okay, it was like
So
one of the
tell
first.
tell us everything.
It was so Sierra Online was the publisher. Like they made these 3D graphic adventure games, like where you move the character around and you would type like the like go like look at the dragon or whatever.
Hmm.
And so they had like King's Quest, which was like their serious epic fantasy one, and Space Quest, which was like their sci-fi satire, and I loved that. And so
Mm.
what I did, I wrote this many adventures of like taking that character who was a space janitor named Roger Wilco, and I put him into the epic anime series Robotech. So he was
Nice.
on
Well, that
board
I
like
know, of course.
so he was on board like the SDF one, like basically cleaning up after like the Veritech pilots and stuff. And so it was like I see now that sort of slice of life approach to epic. I'm like, that's what I do now. It's really much
Yeah,
that.
that's so cool. That just made me realize that there's actually like a whole subgenre of space janitor stories
Are
now.
there?
So, okay, so there's the Canadian show Lex, which is all about a space janitor who, I mean, he's a janitor who stumbles on a spaceship. Very important show. You should definitely check it out. It's extremely silly. But then also there's Space Sweepers, which was a Netflix movie from Korea, which is awesome. And it is
Oh, I'm
literally
gonna
about,
add these.
oh, Mike, you would love Space Sweepers. It's basically about a group of space janitors and they're cleaning up space junk. So they're like hired to just like clean up all the space junk in orbit around Earth. And it's like all of their very
I
sweet
appreciate how Star
adventures.
Trek Lower Decks actually acknowledges this,
Yes.
and like someone has to scrub the holodeck filters, and it's like the
Oh,
grossest stuff
I
in there.
know. I love that. Because there'd be
Yeah,
some bad junk in there.
a lot of bodily fluids.
Of every description. We don't want to know. So all right, so we have time for a couple more questions. So folks, you can put it in the Q&A, you can put it in the chat. Other people in the chat, by the way, are agreeing that your books make them cry. So
Oh, good. Mission
yeah, no, it's a
accomplished.
thing. No, I was reading this on a plane and I was crying, so it was fine.
Excellent.
Nobody noticed, I'm sure. So okay, I wanted to end by asking what's coming next for you. You kind of hinted that there's this possible Last of Us
So
with pets in space.
I mean, like it's in proposal stage right now, and it's not even a solid proposal. It's an idea with a log line right now.
Uh-huh.
What is coming up? So I have the Return of the Jedi anthology that comes out in September-ish. The
Mhm.
last 2 issues of Deep Space Nine come out at the start, like so July, first week of July and first week of August. I hope they let me write more comics because it was really fun and not quite the same pressure as like writing prose. And then in January, I have my time loop book, A Quantum Love Story. What I tried to do with that, I mean, besides taking a time loop thing, I tried to write as close to a romance as I could possibly get. And it was because I'd covered so many different types of relationships, like family, friendship, things like that. And I really wanted to push myself because again, this goes back to the model minority thing, like talking about romance and like seeing it and like writing it makes me cringe. It's really, really difficult. So this was like an exercise in like trying to build it to put that front and center into like this is the primary point of this story is to bring these two together as they're trying to find each other in this time loop. And so that comes out in January, I believe, at the end of January.
Okay, cool. So we have one more question from the audience. This is
Okay.
actually a super awesome question. So I want to make sure that we get to it. So Kelly Nakamura asks or says, there's a really interesting parallel in which Louise and her parents must prioritize survival over personal fulfillment. Louise's parents experienced significant socioeconomic pressures associated with the Asian immigrant experience. And even though Louise was born in the States, she also experiences challenges in attaining enough blood bags. However, Eric's unionization efforts challenge her to think beyond immediate survival. So what parallels can you draw between Eric's unionization efforts and our own society?
Unions are good. I mean,
Union now!
I mean I think it's really interesting, seeing like the screenwriters and like the actors, and like I know there's like the proposed directors thing, but like a lot of people are speaking out against it, and like they're all talking about like, this is not just for us, this is for like future generations, and like the entire landscape of how these production companies like make money and how much money they get and how they can keep making money off back catalog titles, like that did not exist before, and yet the creatives are making like less, a lot of them are making them less than you would make at like Starbucks, and that's not right. And so I think like collective action, which is something that like you and I have talked about a lot.
Yeah.
Collective grassroots action is just so important, because it opens up it when it's done right, and when it's done on a community level, it removes the need for day-to-day just like desperate survival, and then you can start to confront like, who am I and how did I actually get here and who do I want to be. And so like it was very intentional to have that parallel in this particular story, and to take the story of like the app and like blood access, and for Louise to try almost see a little bit of herself in that.
That was really moving, Mike.
Unions are good. Unions
I
are
know,
really
but
good.
also like, yeah, solidarity means that we can find ourselves. I love the idea that through community we actually find ourselves. I think that's a great way to end. Thanks everyone for coming out. I hope that you will come see future events. Please check out San Mateo County Library's upcoming author talks at smcl.org/author talks. They're all really awesome. And we'd also appreciate it if you could tell us how the library did with this program at smcl.org/rate this event. Obviously, this was like a 12 out of 10. Like, I feel like, they're all good events. All right, have a good night, and everybody, and go out and get some blood bags for your fellow vampire union organizers,
right?
Fellow vampire unionists.
And listen to some punk rock.
Yeah, seriously. All
Bye,
right,
everyone.
bye.
Thank you.